Systems engaged. Frequencies synchronized. Prepare for incoming transmission. Coming to you from somewhere in the multiverse, this is Robots from Tomorrow. This show is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, and as always your podcatcher of choice. For the full archive featuring over 800 episodes of comics and comics-friendly content like interviews, book discussions, and freeform tomfoolery, please go to robotsfromtomorrow.net. Here is your host, Greg.
Hello, and welcome to Robots from Tomorrow. My name is Greg. Thank you for joining me. Today's episode marks the halfway point in our 5 episodes and 5 weeks event, and it is a doozy, because today I'm looking at the seminal DC Comics event Crisis on Infinite Earths with DC 3-caster and friend of the show, Brian Salvatore. This is another entry in our Shelf-Bound series, so after Brian and I talk about the event as a whole, we go granular in discussing the pros and cons of different collection approaches to this Marv, Wolfman, George Perez epic. In collecting Crisis, do you go miniseries only? Do you go miniseries, all tie-ins, everything in the kitchen sink? Or some ground in between? Even then, there's a hell of a lot of ground to cover between the 12 issues of the miniseries on one side and the 14 hardcover box set on the other. It is a daunting task to be sure, but one we are more than happy to take on so that you don't have to. Prior to that, I catch up with Brian about life after Multiversity Comics. You'll probably tell from the Mets in the playoffs references that this was recorded last year, but it's still a fun listen. Stay tuned after the chat to find out about a little surprise coming to your podcast feeds this Monday, and be sure to look out for my HeroesCon 2025 chat with Michelle Fife next Thursday, September 25th. But for now, let's take a stroll into the white antimatter together as I talk with Brian Salvatore about DC's 1985 blockbuster event, Crisis on Infinite Earths. Today's guest is the former editorial grand poobah of Multiversity, that longtime comics news site. He is also, the co-host of both the DC 3cast and Force Ghost Coast to Coast podcasts, and doing so many other things. He's probably wondering how he ended up having less time now than when Multiversity was still a thing. He is, of course, Brian Salvatore, and he's here to talk about, among other things, a DC event that not only lived up to the huge amount of hype, but possibly surpassed it, Crisis on Infinite Earths. Brian, how you doing?
Greg, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, my friend. You always make me sound so much more important than I am. This is a really nice sort of other side of the coin to yesterday when my daughter, who is 12 years old, and every bit a 12-year-old, said to me, "Dad, you're not funny and no one cares." So your introduction with that really puts my life in balance. You know, I am fully realized as a person when I can get both sides of this discussion happening at the same time.
Well, that's just one of the extra things we do here at Robots. You know, we like to build, not tear down. So aside from the shifting family dynamic, are you busier now than when you were doing the Multiversity thing?
Yes and no. On one hand, I don't think anybody outside of the sort of inner sanctum of Multiversity understood just how much of my day-to-day was going to that. And not, look, it was not working in a coal mine. I am not trying to project myself as a victim in any way. But even on days when I was not writing anything from Multiversity, or even days when I wasn't editing something from Multiversity, I was doing Multiversity work, whether it's paying bills or, you know, getting the advanced review copies from publishers into our Google Drive so that reviewers can write about them, whether it was arranging interviews, just checking in on staff on pieces that weren't coming in on time, you know, having our little powwows with the editorial team just to make sure we knew what the week looked like, all that sort of stuff. It was a lot of my day-to-day, but I even forgot how much it was because it's just what you do every day. You know, it's only when something changes that you realize how involved it was. And so on one hand, like, it's a lovely thing that when I wake up in the morning, I don't have to think about Multiversity at all. And so in that way, it frees up some space in my brain for other things. However, my brain is a vacuum. And so when there is space to be filled, it gets filled with something. and it has been filled with a bunch of non-comics related projects that have been a lot of fun. I'm a musician. I've been playing in bands for a long time. I'm currently gigging in 4 different bands, which is at least too many. And I have been writing about baseball, podcasts about baseball for 9 years now. And the Mets are in the playoffs, which means I'm doing a lot more of that. And I have, 2 kids that are growing and have activities and interests, and I am required for bits of those. And so, I think if you looked at, middle of May when we were winding Multiversity down versus now, I don't know if there's a ton of difference in terms of my day-to-day, but if you look at certain weeks, I am certainly more busy. But I have to say, what the nicest thing about Multiversity ceasing to exist in an active form is that it is giving me an opportunity to approach comics from a place of it being my hobby again, and not having any of the baggage that comes with having to produce a lot of content about something with it. I mean, look, I'm still doing the DC3 cast, as you mentioned, which requires a fair amount of comic reading, but nothing compared to what I was doing beforehand. And so there are a bunch of comics that I'm way behind on going to the shop and picking some stuff up. But, I'm excited for a bunch of comics in a way that I would have had to not couch that excitement, but like the way I've thought about comics for the last decade plus was always, okay, this comic sounds really good. How can I interview this creator? How can I write about this comic? How can I make something interesting come from this? Whereas it really should just be, this is awesome and I love it and I want to keep loving it. And so that has been the nicest change for me, is just being able to approach comics again from a fan perspective without having the expectation on myself to turn my enjoyment into something else.
Have you found yourself missing anything about the Multiversity experience that maybe you weren't expecting?
I mean, I always knew I'd miss the regular interaction with the crew, Luckily, we have a couple of different Discord servers. There is a DC3 cast specific Discord server for patrons, and there's a Multiversity Discord server for alumni and just readers. If anyone out there is interested in that, you can go to multiversitycomics.com, and there is a link to join our Discord server. So, I haven't totally lost touch with people, but I ran into our mutual friend, Kate Kosterski, in the real world a few weeks ago. And it was really nice to see Kate and just realize, oh, I used to know every bit of Kate's life because we would talk every day about Multiversity stuff. And so, one of us had a migraine, the other one knew it, and that isn't happening as much. So, I miss the people, but we're finding ways to stay in touch, and that's a wonderful thing. In terms of the day-to-day stuff, I always did enjoy conversations with publishers about what they have coming. Like Vince Ostrowski, my co-host in the DC3 cast, often says that the best part about comics is solicits, because it allows you to dream about what it will be and not be disappointed about what it actually is. And I don't agree with him necessarily, but I understand where he's coming from with that. But I always loved getting the email from, insert publicist name here, who's really excited about the new book that Oni is doing, or Marvel, or, whatever publisher it was, and just seeing what the internal thought on the book was. And then the extra fun part of that, because that's something that I think all fans get a sense of when they read solicits, when they read interviews with creators, when they read news articles about new books. But I always got to see it from a sort of unvarnished standpoint, where everybody was it was before any hype was out there or any backlash was out there. And then I would get to see that through the lens of how I read the comic, but also how whoever was scheduled that week to review the comic for Multiversity, how they read it. So I felt I had a really privileged, lucky way to see the industry through, like, seeing its hope, seeing its reality, and seeing its, like, aftermath all in one arc. And oftentimes that arc happened way faster than anyone would have expected it to happen. I can't tell you the number of books that were so hyped and we were all excited for, and then you'd read them and they were just not very good. And then a week later, it seemed like the publisher had totally moved on from it already.
Yeah,
so
the churn.
The churn, yes. I hate the churn in one way, but I also enjoy the churn in another way. I miss Next weekend is New York Comic Con, and I'll probably miss a little bit of that sort of excitement. And I could still do that, obviously. I could still go to New York Comic Con if I wanted to. I won't, probably, because I'm antisocial and claustrophobic.
And the Mets will still be.
Oh yes, the Mets are playing too. Yeah, and also I have a wedding next weekend, so I really, I'm this year I really can't do it, but I am. I do miss the community of comics overall. The thing I thought I would miss that I don't, because it hasn't stopped, is the constant stream of emails from creators and advertisers trying to pitch us stuff. And I have the same stock answer. I say, unless you are a time traveler, you are mistaken. And then I send a link to the article announcing us shutting down. So, sorry, folks.
Let's go from one M to another. You're still podcasting. You're still looking at a larger entity through a very specific lens, a Mets-shaped lens. How is being in Mets land different from being in Multiversity?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So my relationship to comics is insanely personal. And so when I would write about something that I liked or disliked, or podcast about it, or even just read it, I recognize that I am taking this in through the Brian filter, and that the Brian filter and the Greg filter, even though there's a lot of overlap in our filters, are very different things. And so even when I felt like this is the best comic I've ever read, or this is a terrible comic, I knew there was some subjectivity there. Whereas with baseball, I mean, people have written favorites and that sort of thing, but there's no subjectivity to it. You are looking at a score of 2-1, and a team won and a team lost. And so the way I approach baseball is in some ways more analytical than the way I approach comics, because comics make me feel things. And it's not till after I read something that I try to figure out why I feel that way or how I feel that way. With baseball, all the analytical stuff happens way later. In the moment, it is all emotion. If my voice is a little bit weak today, because on Wednesday night I was at the game when the Mets clinched the National League Championship Division Series, rather, and I screamed so loud I lost my voice. That has never happened reading a comic book. As much as I've maybe felt similar elation or disappointment as I have with baseball, it is a much less intellectual experience for me with baseball. It's much more of my lizard brain coming through. And it's also something that feels, how can I put this? I mean, you know me pretty well. You know that a lot of my life is filtered through my relationship with my dad, which is great. A lot of people have terrible relationships with their dads. My dad was my best friend. I miss him every day. He's been gone a couple of years now. And whenever I watch baseball, I think of my dad. And so there is a very emotional component to that. And now that is extended to my brother, who's also a baseball fan, and my son is becoming a baseball fan. So baseball is a very romantic thing for me in just how I interact with it. Whereas comics, I've loved comics as long as I've loved baseball, comics at different points in my life have been something that other people have judged me for. And so I have had to build up a little bit of a wall around my comics fandom that is very much about me and me alone, and my small group of people who I let into this world with me. And so I take comics I take them in such different ways. They are my two interests that are at the most polar ends of how I take things and how I think about them, how I experience them. But in terms of doing the work, the thing is that on the news side, they're exactly the same. If the Mets announced right now that a player was injured, the site that I write for would have the exact same frenzy that Multiversity had when Bendis came to DC, where there's just, you have to write this article as soon as possible because people want to know about this and we want them to know it through us. So the sort of the frenzy is the same, but comics work on a very strict schedule. They're released on Wednesdays, and you have 6 other days to read them or think about them. When baseball season's happening, baseball's on almost every day. And so there is no time to rest in that. And so it feels much more like a marathon than a sprint. Whereas comics, the Monday and Tuesday at Multiversity was always like interviews and TV stuff. And it was a very sort of easier pace. Wednesday through Friday at Multiversity was always a frenzy of editing and getting stuff done. And that's how it is every day in Mets land, at least until the playoffs end. But emotionally, it's just a very different experience. Yeah.
Has having both of those for such a long time helped you let go of something in the moment because you know you're going to have to come up with something the next day? Because I know, like, doing the Multiversity one, the 2000 AD column, we did that weekly. And so if you come up with a really good idea for a review point or something, you're like, hey, great, you really hit that out of the park. What do you got this week? You know, or if you're feeling like, Jesus, just give me a break. You're like, it's okay. You may have struck out on this one. I guess I'm apparently subconsciously trying to use baseball metaphors. You know, you struck out on this one. That's fine. You got another at bat, 6 days or whatever. And I'm very much if I'm going to do a thing, I want it to be comprehensive. It's harder for me to understand breaking things up into smaller pieces, whereas you have to be able to do that in order to really survive. Has that parsing out been easy for you?
Yes. Short answer is it has to be easy for me. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, I would live in a state of constant depression, which, you know, looking at my life, maybe I am living in that state. But no, like the Multiversity one is like the perfect example for this, because you guys were writing about that entire book, just the two of you at first. Mm-hmm. You don't have time to get cute about everything.
No.
You feel like a factory worker in some ways. And I don't mean that as a negative. I mean that as a positive in some ways. Like, I always talk about how my entire life, every job I've ever had for the most part, has been very long-term based. Like, I teach guitar lessons. And so a kid comes into my room the first day, can't hold the guitar. I say the same thing I always start. A guitar is like a giraffe. It has a body and a head and a real long neck. And that's the first thing I say to every student. And when I see a student 6 months down the road playing a guitar solo, I get satisfaction, but that satisfaction has been building the whole time. I've always said my dream job would be a file clerk or a factory worker, where I know all I have to do today is the pile that's here. And once that pile is done, I never have to think about that pile again. Like, it's very different to do something where you're planning long-term versus short-term projects. And so every review, every podcast, every Mets recap, all of that to a certain degree is factory work. It's, you know, that this is what you have to do today. You have to get this done. And then once it's done, you can't think about it anymore because you have to move on to the next thing. And so in some ways, I think that's a very healthy way to think about work, because I am somebody that can beat myself up. I mean, I have shit I said in 6th grade that I still think I should be able to take back somehow. Like, I wish I could take it back, you know. I hold on to this stuff forever. So professionally, to be able to let go of that stuff and know that a typo, or one time, like my first week in Multiversity, or first month maybe, I confused in an article Tony Daniel and Tony Harris, and I knew the difference. I just typed the wrong name. I remember emailing Matt Malikoff, former editor-in-chief of Multiversity, and being like, I am so sorry I made this mistake. He's like, first of all, probably no one noticed. Second of all, you can edit it and fix it, and you did. Third of all, it's over. Who cares? And I've just had to take that attitude, because otherwise I would be beating myself up over every little thing that I got wrong or that I could have done better. And just the way that this stuff works, it's a churn, like you said. You can't let every bit of that affect you, or the churn will stop, and the churn can't stop.
The machine must be fed. Speaking of feeding the machine, even for your DC3cast stuff, you have different things going on, both in front of the paywall and behind the paywall for the DC3cast Patreon experience. Tell us a little bit about what you've got going on there.
Sure, yeah. So DC3cast is weekly on Thursdays now. It was Wednesdays. When DC went to releasing books on Tuesdays to be different, I guess. I still don't know exactly why they changed their day for a while. We moved the show to Wednesdays to come out a day after the books came out, to give folks a chance to read the book. Well, now we're doing that a little bit differently. We're doing it Thursdays. These books are back out on Wednesdays. So weekly on Thursdays, we are looking at DC new releases. We try to limit it to 2 or 3 books a week, just because we feel like we used to do every DC release.
Crazy.
And I don't know why we ever did that. and I don't know how we ever did that. And it was insanity. But now we try to limit it to the 2 or 3 books that we feel are most interesting. And sometimes those are the books that are the marquee titles, and sometimes they're not. And that was a point that my aforementioned co-host Vince Ostrowski really wanted to hammer home, which was like, we don't have to talk about anything. Everything we talk about should be the stuff we want to talk about. And I sort of fought against that a little bit, just because I felt like people are coming to us for something and we need to provide the thing that they are coming to us for. And Vince correctly pointed out that they're coming to us because of us, and that it's more important for them to hear us passionate on one way or another than to just say it's fine, which was half of our review. When we were doing like all the Rebirth titles, I can't tell you how many discussions started and ended with, this is, Batman number 41, written by so and so, illustrated by so and so. It was fine. And Zach would say, yeah, art was good. And Vince would say, yeah, I didn't like this part. And then we were done talking about it because that's all we had to say. So to be more passionate, to be more thoughtful about what we're talking about, to have longer discussions, that's sort of what we wanted to do with the limiting the number of books. Anyway, that's just the main show. On the Patreon, we do a lot of like silly bonus episodes. When Zach isn't there, Vince and I do a sub show. When I'm not there, Vince and Zach do a sub show. When Vince isn't there, Zach and I do a sub show. I tend to do some bonus episodes when I have a thought in my brain. I just want to get out of my brain. I'll talk about it. But the main thing we do is every Monday we have an episode that is about a very specific comic, or 2 or 5. For a while, we've been doing this project. Well, let me start. We did a project called The New 52 in 52 Minutes, where every New 52 book got a 52-minute review episode from us. Some of those we had cut off in the middle. Some of those we had to drag it out for 30 extra minutes because there was nothing to say. But it was a fun gimmick and we liked it. Then we switched to a read-through of the entirety of Grant Morrison's DC writing, starting with the prose pieces in the back of Batman and Superman annuals. And when we paused that right before DC 1 million. In the breaks there, we have been covering other DC events and books and just topics we're interested in to give us a break from Morrison. And that's my caveat, as listeners of the show will know. I like Grant Morrison very much. I might even say I love Grant Morrison, but I am somebody who doesn't want to read the same stuff week in and week out. I really like reading a wider variety of stuff. And so the sort of compromise we came to here was that we were going to read little things in between Grant Morrison projects. So we're still doing that. However, there was a rumor from Bleeding Cool that still has not been confirmed that James Robinson was going to be reviving Starman. And we always talked about wanting to have Starman as part of our podcast. And so for the last few months, we have been reading Starman in between the Grant Morrison stuff. And then we decided, let's just plow through Starman. And so we have been reading all of Grant Morrison's Starman and all the adjacent titles as well. Not Grant Morrison, James Robinson's Starman and all the subsequent titles as well, the miniseries, the one-shots, etc. And we are taking a break right now because Zach is on leave. I am not at liberty to say why he is on leave per his requests, but Zach is on leave right now, doing some other stuff. So he'll be back in a few weeks and we'll resume. We're actually going to take a little break from Starman to do the whole DC 1 million event and then basically finish out Starman before going back to the Grant Morrison stuff. So for $5 a month, you get at least 4 bonus episodes a week, but usually more 6 a month or so, with various shows that are about comics or aren't about comics. Right now with Zach on leave, Vince and I are with our good friend and former Multiversity podcaster Walter Richardson talking about the Naked Gun movies, because why not? Because we all love the Naked Gun movies, and so it's what we're talking about. And we're just having a good time. The DC3 Patreon was never meant to be a substitute for any of our jobs. It was just an opportunity to do a little bit more. We always wanted to do more, but I think all three of us had this sense of we were doing a lot of bonus episodes at a certain point on the main feed, and it just felt like diminishing returns. We were taking a lot of time away from our families, away from our jobs to do this. And while this is not bringing a ton of money by any means, it pays for our DC Universe and Marvel Unlimited subscriptions for the year. It pays for the pro version of Zoom. And every now and then I'm able to send Vince or Zach a little bit of money for doing the show. And that just feels like a nice thing to be able to do. So it's a great community of folks on our Discord. It's probably, we have more members than this. We're probably about 10 or 12 really active folks on the Discord who are just the loveliest people in the world, Greg being one of them. And just, talking about comics and everything else and just laughing a whole lot. The DC3 is one of the purest things in my life in terms of just enjoyment, even though I fight with those two guys like we're married sometimes.
Your wives, I guess, would be.
Yes, our wives. Thank you. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I'd forgotten it was only $5 a month. It is a steal at twice the price for that, because the Morrison read through, the Starman read through. I am so glad that Vince and Zach love that book as much as they do.
Because you and I really love that book.
Oh, that is a special book. For
the more I reflect on it,
a bunch of reasons.
Yeah, I feel like you'll appreciate this very specifically. I feel like the reason that book resonates with me so much is related to something you said earlier, where you said that you see everything like on the macro. You don't like to break things up into smaller pieces. You like to do epic big things. And this feels like an epic story about normal life. Like, yes, they are superheroes, and yes, fantastic things are happening to them. But it seems like everything that happens in Starman is secondary to the personal lives of the characters in the book. Jack is only a superhero because it mends his relationship with his father to a certain degree. There is so much humanity and real life within the Cape comic stuff that it scratches both of those itches for me. It is both a very personal, very slice of life comic in a way, while also being about the devil pulling people into hell and person with shadow powers and all that other stuff. So it speaks to both sides of comics that I love.
Yeah, I love my Claremont X-Men. I do. But Robinson's Starman may be the platonic ideal of how to do a superhero in a shared universe. So to see it get the minute attention that you guys give it and that you enjoy it so much, that alone, $5 a month. Yeah, absolutely. And plus, your deep dive as part of the early Morrison stuff, that was before Starman, that was my favorite of you guys, really just pouring over those issues and stuff. And I was like, all right, well, that's the apex. And then Starman came on. I was like, oh no, this is the stuff.
Well, it's first of all, I appreciate all the kind words that you always say about our show. Whenever you say it, it warms my heart considerably. But one of the things that is rare for our show is agreement. And I don't
consensus.
Consensus. Yeah, it's just like we tend to like different things, and that's good. The show would not be interesting with 3 Brians or 3 Zachs or 3 Vinces. It wouldn't be. But even when we like the same stuff, a lot of times we like it for different reasons. And I feel like with Starman, it's one of the few things that I think we all like it for the same reasons. Like our experiences are very similar reading it. And that wouldn't work on everything we do, but it's nice to have it work once in a while.
Yeah. So let's stay in the DC corner. Let's shift a little bit, because I wanted to do another entry in the Shelfbound series that we do here on the show, where we brainstorm comic book collected editions that don't exist but should. Now, Crisis has not been left wanting in terms of collected editions, but it's such a sprawling work that there's still a lot of different ways to get that comic out of your long box and onto your shelf. I did a Shelfbound column on Crisis specifically back in 2020. January 1st, 2020. I kicked off 2020 with an article on Crisis. You're welcome.
That's just too perfect. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I need to sit with that for a minute. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I've done Shelfbound on this book before, but I'm now bringing in a DC expert to see if those ideas and methodologies.
Expert is a strong word. Expert's a strong word.
Quote, expert, unquote.
There you go.
You guys did your whole Crisis management series, kicking it off with about 2 hours talking about Crisis itself. So people should definitely check that out, because it is a wonderful dive into that event. But just for some context, can you give us what your impression of it was when you read it versus like now?
I did not read this when it was happening or even shortly thereafter. The first comics I remember reading had the Legends tag on top, so it was shortly after this. And so I was aware of Crisis on Infinite Earths before I ever read it. I want to say I didn't read it in its entirety until the late 90s. Maybe I read it slightly before. It's hard to remember the limited number of ways you could ingest comic books before the 21st century. Like, I don't think my local library collected comics until maybe the year 2003, 2004, something like that. There were no graphic novels in my local library. And so if you wanted to read a comic, you had to buy it or you had to have a friend who had it. None of my friends had Crisis, and I probably didn't have enough disposable income to be buying Zero Hour and the Crisis trade at the time, so I was aware of the broad strokes of it. I had read, I think, an issue. I think my cousin Ian had issue 6, maybe, is the one that tends to stand out in my head. But I had read bits and pieces of it. But when I finally read it, I have to say I went into it with very low expectations because I had heard so much good stuff about it and I didn't want to be disappointed by it. I think that a lot of times comics, specifically event comics, hit differently when they're not being read in the time in which they're being released. Like, I remember I had read Zero Hour as it was coming out, and I loved it because, of course, I did at that time. And I still have a lot of warm feelings towards parts of Zero Hour. But having like Vince and Zach read it for the show, they had far fewer warm feelings about it because with time and distance, it just changes the way you read it, which makes total sense. It's true of everything, but I think especially event comics, because when you're reading them in the moment, there's that churn we talked about before. There's the hype from the publisher and the hype from the dude at the comic store and the hype from your buddy who read the issue before you did. There's all of this ancillary stimuli hitting your brain when it's coming out in real time. I say all that to say I loved Crisis the first time I read it, but I have to say I never really considered it one of my favorite events in that time period. Having reread it half a dozen more times since then, I think it pretty much stands as the best event comic of all time. Not necessarily my favorite event comic of all time, but the best event comic of all time for a number of reasons that we'll get to.
In 2020, how does DC approach putting out an event comic of this scale?
The short answer is they don't. Nothing's of this scale. That's not me looking at this with rose-colored glasses and saying, nothing can ever be Crisis again. Like, when you think about that, Crisis was planned out for at least a year, if not a couple of years.
It's a couple of years.
It is a couple of years, right? Yeah. Before it was published, that they really made sure they had all their ducks in a row, that they got the best talent they could to be a part of it, that they committed a year to telling the story. None of that happens anymore at all. There is a sort of running joke on the DC3 cast, and I think more off the air than on the air, but that the only reason DC does events right now is that they know it's the easiest way to set up the next status quo. That the event almost doesn't matter. For instance, we just finished Absolute Power, which I liked more than Vince and Zach, but I still didn't love for a bunch of reasons. But the reason Absolute Power exists is they wanted to do this big all-in initiative. And the easiest way to shuffle the deck was to make an event at the center of it. Crisis was obviously an event that had an agenda. There was a serious agenda in wanting to eliminate the multiverse, have a more streamlined story. To ignore that part of Crisis is a fool's errand. However, equal effort was put on making sure that story was good than it being important to the overall line. That is the part that has changed. People at DC no longer think about the the fact that this is going to have to sit on a shelf next to Crisis on Infinite Earths and other great DC works. And so we have to make it mean something. I mean, the word crisis was not used for a decade after Crisis on Infinite Earths. And then 0 Hour, Crisis in Time. And then it wasn't used for a decade after that until Infinite Crisis. And then the wheels came off the bus and it started being crisis this, crisis that all the time. But that term used to really stand for, this is the most important work happening at DC right now, and it's going to matter for a long time. And for those first couple events, whether you like them or not, I think you can't deny the intent behind them was very pure, to not just move the status quo from A to B, but to tell a really memorable story in that space. And I think that is what's missing now. I guess one of the things that we should probably talk about is when this all started. So when did the idea for Crisis first pop up? Was it 83?
81.
81?
Yeah. So, the idea is cooking in Marv's head. He's got Peter Sanderson reading all of DC. He starts feeding in ideas of like, I'm going to have the Monitor start showing up, in Titans and some other places. And he's working with editorial, but there were real fiefdoms, much more so at the time than there are now. Now there are families, right? But it's all controlled by, there was no DiDio to be like, this is what we're doing.
Right, exactly.
That's
the plan. We're doing this.
Yeah, it's so much of a better impression than mine.
I've been doing it for a long time. I have practice here.
Yeah. So this thing was going on so long, and it was something that was out in the open that they were working towards this, that Marvel had Secret Wars 1 and basically Secret Wars 2 come out by the end of Crisis. Now, obviously, Secret Wars is not trying to do anything of what Crisis is trying to do, but Marv essentially wrote the rule book on how to do these sort of things, right?
Yes.
Like he's making stuff up as it goes. And Crisis, when it works, it really works. And again, listen to the DC3Cast Crisis Management episode to really get into the nitty gritty of where things work. But it's him trying to be the editor while he's doing this. Somebody should have really offloaded that editorial stuff to somebody else, preferably somebody who was, a DiDio style ball breaker, to get other people in line on this. Now, George Perez obviously has worked very close with Wolfman. He basically came on as co-editor with issue 5 because he was working on the pages, and something happens at the end of 3 that essentially happens again at the end of 4, and nobody caught it. And he's like, what the fuck? Marv, what? It is crazy. You're like the JSA guy.
Yes.
Crisis on Infinite Earths is like Crisis on Earth, Roy Thomas. All of his stuff was basically like, yeah, we're getting rid of everything. And to his credit, which is not a phrase I thought I would say in 2024, going back and look at these notes, he really did try and work with losing Golden Age Superman, Golden Age Batman, Golden Age Wonder Woman, and all this stuff, because not only of Justice Society stuff, but also Infinity Incorporated, all of his legacy stuff, which is huge in DC, he got all of that really kicked out from under him. Have you read a bunch of the Roy Thomas
I have
versions of those? What's your opinion of those?
Well, Roy Thomas is a very old-fashioned writer in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And some of that stuff just bounces off my smooth brain. I can't remember a lot of those stories. It's funny. There are certain comics I've read one time where I can tell you panels from those books. And there's others that I've read a 50-issue run by a creator, and I can tell you like the broad strokes maybe of what happens there. And that's what I feel about Roy Thomas and stuff in this era. I appreciate what he was trying to do. I think that having Earth 2 continue in real time is one of the cooler ideas that DC had. And I sort of wish that never went away, because it would be fascinating to read a story set in 2024, 90 years after the first story is set on what we now call Earth 2.
Mm-hmm.
I love that idea. And I think Roy Thomas was doing relatively interesting stuff with both the sort of All-Star Squadron era of it and also the Infinity Inc. stuff. I like the idea of the Infinity Inc. a lot. When Jeff Johns took over JSA, he basically made JSA a combination Justice Society Infinity Inc. book, because it became about both the sort of traditional heroes and the younger offspring, right? I love all of that. All that's great. I'm totally on board for all of this. Roy Thomas just isn't my favorite writer for this stuff. And Roy Thomas, like, there's that, what's it called? Just Society versus the United States? Is that what?
Yes. America versus the
America versus Society. Yes.
Society. Yeah.
When was the last time you read that?
Actually, like about a week ago.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
But before that, I don't think I'd ever really read it.
Okay. There are some parts in that book that are just like maddening from a reader's perspective. I've mentioned that on the DC3cast multiple times. There's a part where Wildcat thinks to himself about a time when he was doing some other stuff, and the end of the panel says, but that doesn't really matter here, or whatever. Like, Roy Thomas feels the need to just include every idea he's ever had or anything that's ever happened in the book. And so because of that, they're the least streamlined books you've ever read. They're just piles of information that don't always make an interesting story. This is my very long-winded way of saying I don't really like Roy Thomas that much.
Okay.
There are other reasons to dislike Roy Thomas as well.
Yeah. Considering this was basically taking away his entire job at DC, he was not okay with it, but he really did try to make it work in terms of the notes. And then, the next 30 years happened, and that brings us to where we are. I do have in my notes, James Robinson equals post-crisis Roy Thomas. And James Robinson is the Roy Thomas that I want those Roy Thomas-y ideas to be filtered through. And I guess that means, Robinson / Johns, right? Because Johns picked up from a JSA that really built off of Robinson's golden age and that stuff.
And I will say, I think today, the closest we have to that is Mark Waid. It's not a one-to-one parallel, but Waid is the guy who is still holding the torch for all that older stuff.
Yeah. But can write it in a way that doesn't make me think like paid by the word.
Exactly.
Paid by the word. Going, broader. I had a thought that post-crisis DC could have been handled like post-Lucasfilm Star Wars. Like, people thought of all this stuff's gone and like we can't refer to it. But if you go back and look at some of these notes, Marv is saying this doesn't necessarily have to get rid of a lot of stuff. It just gives you a chance to reintroduce it in a way that you can make better stories off of, or it doesn't contradict with other things.
Right. Right.
So going back and looking at these notes, Marv, for all the times you're just like, he really did have some good ideas. Like, everything needs to start at issue 1 after this. Nobody should remember the crisis and all of these things. And he was shot down on, obviously, all of it, right? Dick Giordano was like one of the worst mistakes he made as editor-in-chief was not doing a hard reboot of everything post-crisis. There is an interesting quote Marv has said in an interview. He was not allowed to do the ending that he wanted. The heroes would all start next month and no one would ever remember the crisis had ever happened. And I was told that the editors didn't like that because if the heroes didn't remember all of their stories, it would invalidate everything that had existed previously. To which Marv answered with extreme sarcasm, quote, "Our heroes don't buy our comic books. The fans do, and they will still have all those books on their shelves, and they will remember all those things. But the editors overruled it, so that's why the heroes go back in time before the world is reformed, and then they come back. They didn't cease to exist and get reborn. They were there the whole time. And then 5 years of everybody talking about what really happened in Crisis, which is, as Marv knew, exactly what would happen."
Yes.
So I can't remember who originally said this idea, but DC and Marvel should have switched editors around this time. DC needed a Jim Shooter / Dan DiDio type of, you're doing this, you're doing this, you're doing this. And Marvel really needed someone with a looser hand to help them not be this stock company. And if that had happened, not the editorial switching, but if DC had pulled off a cohesive Crisis, oh my God, like it boggles the mind.
It really does, because I mean, on one hand, I think a lot of good comics came out of the post-crisis era, and I have a lot of personal fond memories of the post-crisis era.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. A lot of those subsequent 3 or 4 or 5 years is spent just talking about the crisis,
right,
and relitigating the crisis in some ways, making post hoc changes to what actually happened in Crisis. And it all feels very messy. But part of me likes the messiness. And that is where I have this fractured take on it. Where on one hand, I don't want the messiness to go away. But on the other, I also don't want to have a line that is constantly referencing the past and not doing anything interesting. Because that's the line that DC has given us for a lot of the last 30 years.
Yeah. What do you think makes a event a crisis versus it just being a bad day at the office?
To me, the term got destroyed by an unlikely source, which is Grant Morrison, actually.
Okay.
I don't think Final Crisis should have been called Final Crisis. If you look at the three, and I'm not gonna, identity crisis isn't a thing. I understand that the word crisis is there purposely. Maybe we'll say that Brad Meltzer.
Double entendre.
Yeah, but maybe we'll say that Brad Meltzer killed the term crisis, because I feel like if you look at the big three before Final Crisis of Crisis on Infinite Earths, 0 Hour, and Infinite Crisis, each of them deal with the fabric of the DC universe. Crisis on Infinite Earths obviously eliminates the multiverse from conversation for a long time, and it brings everything into a finer focus. What 0 Hour tries to do is take the mess of the Infinite Earths that was cleaned up in Crisis and apply it to the mess of the timeline and fix it. I would argue it does a worse job than Crisis does, but it's attempting something here. Infinite Crisis is really the only true sequel to Crisis on Infinite Earths we've ever gotten. Because it deals with Superboy Prime and Lois and Clark all being trapped in their little limbo area, whatever. That is dealing with the converse of Crisis on Infinite Earths, which is the reinstitution of the multiverse. And that takes 52 and a couple other things to really happen, but you understand what I'm saying here. I feel like a story that earns the name Crisis needs to be something that truly remakes the DC universe. Doesn't just get to a new status quo, but remakes it in a number of ways. I think if you're talking about DC Comics and the way that you consider the eras post-Crisis, there's the first 10 years until 0 Hour. There's the second 10 years until Infinite Crisis. To me, then the next jump is Flashpoint, which I think is a bad event, but that's a crisis. That totally remakes the DC universe. After that, I don't think anything really has lived up to the term crisis. I think if it had been done properly, came out on time, and really committed to the bit, of all the stuff we've seen, Doomsday Clock might actually be the closest to a crisis. Again, I don't like Doomsday Clock, but in terms of what it was trying to do, that seems most crisis-y to me. I don't know. Do you have a different definition of what a crisis is?
I think it's in line with yours. What I wrote down is it feels like it's a story of this type that brings together a disparate group of characters. And I wrote down Spider-Verse as an example of not what I'm talking about. When I think of Crisis, it's Captain Carrot standing next to Anthro, standing next to Swamp Thing, standing next to Tommy Tomorrow, right? It has to be disparate parts of this quote unquote universe coming together to solve something. That is the thing I kept hitting on in terms of what makes something feel like a crisis versus, like I said, a bad day at the day at the office.
Yeah, I think sometimes that is, and that's a very fair and good definition. I'll also say, though, I think sometimes that is what makes crisis books not work as well. For instance, we were recently talking in a group chat about, we being the DC3, about Sinestro Court War and how that is a really great Green Lantern event. Because even though it brings in stuff like Superboy Prime and it goes slightly outside of the Green Lantern mythos, because it's so focused, it can tell a really clean, straight story. Whereas when you're trying to bring all of these different disparate elements together, you're not always going to succeed in that story making a lick of sense or working well together. So being a crisis in some ways is a double-edged sword.
Yeah. That was one of the things Marv said he was the most proud about for Crisis, that he was able to bring all of these characters together into a story that made sense. And I think for the most part, he basically succeeded, right?
Yeah.
Okay. What do you feel is the essential crisis experience?
I'm of two minds about this because
Mhm.
I think for both of us, we tend to have this mindset of when you're collecting stuff, specifically with you when you're binding stuff, there's this idea that you need to have the complete experience, right? I completely understand the desire to put everything that needs to be contained in a volume to be in that volume so that it can feel as complete and essential as possible. The problem with that is that definition changes like every day for me, right? So some days I'm, oh, this isn't necessary. And then as soon as I'm, quote, done, I regret that I didn't include that thing that was in there. And so on one hand, I feel like I'm speaking to your soul right now by saying this.
I am so seen right now.
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
It's exactly how I am too. So, it's how it works. So I tend to think that the easiest way to do this, and easiest isn't best, but hear me out for a second.
Okay.
The easiest way to do this is to just start with the simplest possible solution here, which is Crisis is 12 issues, just collect those 12 issues.
Mhm.
And then my thought process after that is, okay, if I had to write like an academic paper for a college course on Crisis on Infinite Earths,
Mhm.
what else would I have to cite in that paper that if I didn't cite it, the Gregs, Vinces, and Zachs in my life would say, like, you fool, you forgot
Yeah.
to cite this. So I start with the primary source, and then I go with anything that I feel would have to be there in order to make it at least feel somewhat complete. What's tricky about that is, to me, Crisis has about 10 different things that one could argue are essential, but I think that an equal number of people would say that's not. To me, I guess what I'm trying to say is, to me, there's no slam dunk. Without this, you couldn't have a Crisis collection, except for the 12 issues of Crisis.
Mhm.
Is there anything that you feel is, for instance, I'm going to go to Infinite Crisis here for a second. The special that preceded Infinite Crisis, where Maxwell Lord kills Ted Cord.
Mhm. Mhm.
You couldn't, to me, tell the full Infinite Crisis story without acknowledging Ted Cord's death. Is there anything like that with you with Crisis?
No, I think your starting point of here's the 12 issue series, boom, that's the nucleus, the starting
Right.
point of you want to read Crisis, here's Crisis.
Yeah.
I think, and maybe this is why I keep coming back to this work for these type of things, is that there's such a buildup to it and such a reverberation from it that
Yes.
figuring out the different ways to have contexts for it and from it are what fascinates me, right? Like, is there any other work in mainstream comics that has this type of ripple effect?
Well, I mean, if we're talking about the ripple, then I could make the. I don't even want to say that I agree with this, because I don't think I agree with this. But I think you should include Legends then in this. The Legends miniseries.
Yeah. So, okay. I'm glad you brought that up. Then the question becomes, in terms of a DC reading order, yes. In terms of a physical product, how do you make that physical, right? DC has come out with a $500 Crisis box set that has all of Crisis on Multiple Earths, but we're all like the JLA, JSA,
Right.
crossovers and all that stuff leading up. The 12 issues, all of the tie-ins, and then like a, behind the scenes book. If you were going to do something like that, then yeah, you could throw in Legends at the very end, because Legends, as I'm sure you know, was originally pitched as a Crisis of the Soul. So it's another Crisis, but it's a Crisis in a completely different direction. And I like Legends. If you were going to do that, then one could make a case that you'd also need to put in the history of the DC universe in there.
I think that's a good call as well.
And then some Who's Who stuff
Well, I mean,
in there.
you don't have to argue with me about that.
Yeah.
But
I'm not going to get any pushback on that, but like, how
No.
big does it,
well, yeah, but so that's what I was going to say. Like, part of this, you got to take a step back here and say, what is the reason for collecting this? If the reason for collecting it is just to collect Crisis, that's one thing. If the reason for collecting it is to give people an idea of what DC was attempting to do with Crisis, I think Legends is actually more important then, because Legends is the event that is only possible because of Crisis. With all of the continuities coming together, with the reboot of Wonder Woman and the reboot of Captain Marvel and the reboot of the Justice League spinning out of this, and the first time that Darkseid and Apocalypse and the Fourth World in general really gets integrated into like the mainline DC universe. To understand what the next 10 years were going to be, you need Legends as the answer to why was there a Crisis on Infinite Earths. The answer is Legends. Does that make sense at all?
It does. It does.
But again, it depends why you're collecting it, I guess, is the question.
Then I think that's a question not necessarily of collecting, but of publishing. From a publishing thing, you could say, here's your Crisis stuff, and then your next collection can be Legends. And I've toyed with the idea of having a Legends collection that is the Legends miniseries, and then Batman Year One, Superman, Man of Steel, whatever equivalent number of issues of the Wonder Woman series would be, right? And basically have, here's the beginning of the post-Crisis stuff, which unfortunately is a little tough to eyeball in terms of what is what, because they didn't have the New 52 start off with #1 type of thing, which
you almost need, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Greg. You almost need like a collection of the pre-Crisis stuff and the collection of the post-Crisis stuff to make the collection of Crisis make sense.
Yeah. The latter half of that was what I was aiming for in the book that you have. I'm not going to go pre-Crisis, but we're going to have Crisis, context around it, and then some of the ripples from that. And so it's interesting now, since, let's see, I did that book in 2018, 2019. I wrote the article in 2020. Now that DC's online presence and stuff has grown or whatever, almost everything included in the book before and would include now is available on DC Infinite?
Universe Infinite, yeah.
DC Universe.
Too many names.
It's Infinite, but it's Infinite Ultra, or it's Infinite Deluxe.
Exactly,
and you're like, oh, +2, whatever. So it's much easier to read this stuff now because I can basically just say whatever I think the reading list should be, and you can go from issue to issue. You don't have that physical limitation of it can only be X number of pages. I love looking at Omnibuy. I don't love reading Omnibuy.
Agreed.
I got the Walt Simonson Thor omnibus when it came out, and I had it split into 2 books because I was like, I actually want to read this at some point, and I just can't. I don't have the furniture structure to be able to read this thing. So the book that you have right now, the 2024 version of how I would do that is a little different. I've actually split it into 2 volumes.
Okay. Are you pulling anything out of this volume?
Yes. I'm pulling out the history of the DC universe.
Oh, you're breaking my heart.
I'm not saying it goes away. I'm just saying I would start off a Legends book with it.
Okay.
Right? Like
okay.
start out, do that, and then go into Legends. Or I would have it with a Who's Who book, right?
Right.
In a lot of ways, it was conceived as part of Crisis. It was going to be the epilogue of Crisis. And
well, so before DC collected Who's Who, I was planning a basically 15-volume, what I was calling the DC Comics reference library.
Mm-hmm.
And I was going to try to bind all of this. So volume 1 was going to be Who's Who 1 through 15. Volume 2, Who's Who 16 to 26, plus the Amazing Heroes Who's Who art credits / missing entries piece.
Mm-hmm.
Then History of the DC Universe 1 and 2. And
right.
Are you aware of the 50 Who Made DC Great book?
Vaguely.
So it's a oversized one-shot comic published for DC's 50th anniversary, where it's basically Who's Who entries for actual people.
Ooh.
So, basically all the creators and publishers, and I want to say like maybe George Reeves is in there, like, so I felt like that was an important thing to include in there. So I agree with you that History of the DC Universe is really more of a reference work than it is a story.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas this was supposed to be like, I wanted to make, this reference library. I have been since thinking about how I want to do this with the 2 omnibuy that DC released. There's a couple of entries that are not in the new omnibus because of rights issues.
Like the Atari Force stuff.
Exactly. So I have all those in singles.
Yeah.
And so I think it's going to be like maybe it would be 5 volumes now. From 15, I would pare it down. Because like I had the entire run of Secret Origins.
Mm-hmm.
I had the entire run of Secret Files and Origins.
Ooh.
And then I had one book that was all of the back matter from 52 and Countdown to Final Crisis.
52 done right.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And the DC Universe Legacies book, the Multiversity source book, all of that stuff in there. But yeah, that's all. Back to Crisis.
Interestingly enough, the Atari Force stuff is in the digital version.
I know. I don't know how that happened.
Somebody's asleep at the wheel, thank God. Yeah. Okay. So the book that you have in front of you has Crisis 1 through 12 and some contemporaneous back matter and post-Crisis reverberations. The official Crisis Infinite Earths index, the crossover index, some interviews from Comics Interview number 25 and Amazing Heroes 61 and 96, I think. The Legends of the DC Universe Crisis one-shot stuff from JLA Incarnations number 5, Starman Annual number 1, Animal Man 2324, The Flash 149, 150, and then Christmas with the Superheroes number 2. In terms of the non-miniseries stuff that's in there, do you have a particular favorite?
I mean, I love all the reference stuff in there.
Oh, and History of the DC Universe. Sorry,
yes,
I forgot.
Yes.
That is in the book.
The official guides, the contemporaneous interviews, like all that stuff is really right up my alley.
Mm-hmm.
Just because what I love about the way that you approach binds and the way that I think everybody should approach binds, is that if you're not just going to buy DC's collection of Crisis, what are you bringing to it that is making it special and unique? And while I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in here, like there is that bit from the JLA issue you talked about. There's that one shot from the, what was it called? The DC Universe.
Legends of the DC Universe.
Yeah. All those things are fine. I don't know if any of those necessarily enhance the Crisis story. They remind me of, have you read any of the Star Wars from a Certain Point of View books?
No, but I've heard you talk about them.
Yeah, so they're basically like short story collections, and you get to hear a little bit more about various musicians at the cantina in Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
And like, while that stuff is interesting and fun, does it improve Star Wars? I would argue no, it doesn't. And I feel the same way about those stories in this, where they certainly are references and there are a couple of neat little wrinkles in there, but I don't know if I would consider any of those even close to essential or enhancing the story. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I disagree enough in that I put them in the book, but I agree enough in that, like, so the Legends of the DC Universe is essentially Crisis issue 4.5.
Right.
So there's the idea of, are you going to include it? If you're going to include it, are you going to just include it in the book, or are you going to put it in context? So if you're reading 4 issues of Wolfman and Perez, then you get to Wolfman and Paul Ryan. I love Paul Ryan. Again, not the politician. Paul Ryan was completely underrated. He was the guy who was the backup hitter for a lot of superstar artists.
Yes.
Completely underrated. Anyway, in your reading experience, continuity-wise, it goes between issue 4 and 5. In the narrative, it goes there. But in terms of your reading experience, I was like, no, that's a bit too much of a jump. So I put it at the end. I didn't want to break up the flow of that reading experience. Issue. Yeah. So I agree with you in spirit.
Well, like, do you think that having read that Legends of the DC Universe story, that you have I don't want to say greater understanding or more joy. Like, do you feel that is additive to the actual story of Crisis?
Yes, but like it's bonus.
Sure.
Right?
Okay.
Like when I think of
It's a
Crisis,
deleted scene.
for the other things that I included, they're not necessary, but hopefully pick the ones that were the most additive. So the Starman Annual, which opportunity to plug, you and the lads talked about on your Patreon Starman read through, plays off of one panel from issue 10, right? One of the,
Yes.
this is what's going on somewhere else in the universe. But it's such a good story by Robinson and Brett Blevins that after reading it, when I go back and read Crisis and I see that panel, my brain goes to this 12-year later, quote unquote, tie-in,
Right.
and it improves the experience for me. Right.
Yeah, I can't really argue with that. That is, I mean,
Ironclad. There you go.
you also know my feelings on Starman and James
Yeah, that's why
Robinson, so,
that is one of the reasons I picked that, that particular one.
so that example works well.
You know,
But the only place that I really disagree with that is just that I don't know. I really try to not get in my head too much about this stuff, but there are times that I wonder, what are the things we're responding to? Are we responding to things that matter to the story or stuff that is nostalgic to us in there? And therefore, that's why, like it just, it can be very hard to tell exactly why certain things resonate with us. And so
it resonates differently for different people.
Of course, yes. But I'm not mad about that inclusion,
Yeah. And if you don't like it, you just skip over it.
Right, exactly.
So how I would do this now, and again, this is trying to fit a certain amount of material with the mini, the stuff that I feel gives really good context and the best stuff that Crisis inspired. I would do this in 2 books.
I'm sorry,
one.
I just want to say, you didn't. I don't think you mentioned that you have the Last Days of the Justice Society in here.
Yeah, yes. As you were talking, I thought of that, and I was going to mention it, but then I moved on. But yes, and it's a little important because it's also 48 pages. So everything I'm including in these actual books, there's a cost to them, right? Like, is this worth 48 pages of this book? And you could argue, for that thing in particular, it very much starts off right after Crisis. So would that go here? Or would that be a better thing to start off Legends, like the beginning of the post-Crisis stuff? Anyway, so 2 books. Book 1 is Crisis 1 through 10. Everything up through the remaking of the universe. And then Amazing Heroes 61, an interview done probably around issue 3 or 4 of Crisis, the Legends of the DC Universe issue, the JLA Incarnations, Starman Annual 1, and the first half of Swamp Thing number 46, which is Swamp Thing and Constantine are brought up to the Monitor's satellite. Swamp Thing meets Alex Luthor. Alex Luthor is saying, oh, you're going to take care of the spiritual side of things for us. And the Swamp Thing's like, what are you talking about? And of course, Constantine's, yeah, we got that. Let's go. I didn't include that in your book because I didn't think about it, but I would include it here for 2 reasons. One, it's Alan Moore, Bissett and Toddleben. And you get another flavor of more talking about superheroes. So he's not saying Superman and Batman and this. It's the man who can create a diamond by crushing coal in his hand. It's a different perspective of that famous 2-page spread experience. I wouldn't put it next to that issue of Crisis, but all of these things would be at the end as back matter, special matter.
Right.
Book 2 is Crisis 11 and 12, the last bit of the series. This is where I would put the indexes, the back matter from Comics Interview, Amazing Heroes, and then I would expand some of that post-Crisis material. I think I would maybe take out the Last Days of the Justice Society. I would go Swamp Thing 49 and 50, I think, maybe 48 and 50, depending on how much space I had, because that is the spiritual crisis Alex Luthor mentions in the Swamp Thing tie-in earlier. It's also where we see the darkness in person, and it ties in with Dark Crisis on Infinite Earths.
Yep.
right? So the Swamp Thing issues are great because you have this war in the heavens. The demon shows up, the Phantom Stranger shows up, Dead Man shows up, everything's going to hell, almost literally. This is where Zatanna's father dies as part of that group of mystics holding hands, and somebody bursts into flames at the table, and you're just like, oh, yeah, what is going on? Swamp Thing saves the day. I won't say how. It's really good. And as a ripple from Crisis, depending on how spacing goes, I might do the Legion of Superheroes, Man of Steel, Superboy 4-parter, because in terms of Crisis ripple effect, pre-Crisis Superboy taken out of circulation, that's probably the biggest one. I'm not the hugest Legion fan, which is probably why I didn't put it in there before. But since we split these into 2 books, if I had the space, I would put those in, maybe. Then going a little further, Animal Man 23 and 24. Again, Patreon plug. You know, you and the lads covered that very well in your Morrison reread. I would then do The Flash 149 and 150, which is the tail end of Chain Lightning. Mark Waid and Paul Pelletier doing Wally having to replace Barry in Crisis because something happens to Barry, and Wally's like, oh shit, I gotta go take his place. And so we see a version of Crisis where Wally is there at the Andy Manor canon. Wally is there at the end and helps tell us why Barry was the only person who could do what he did. And then this one's sort of iffy. There was a Dark Multiverse issue that tied in with Crisis. And those Tales of the Dark Multiverse are, they're really what ifs.
They are what ifs, yes.
And so I was like, okay, where was the point of the split? And the split was, instead of the JSA being sent to fight Surtur, which happened in the last days of Justice Society special, it was the Justice League, and they were defeated. So Surtur comes to Earth and all the things that it's interesting. Steve Orlando and Mike Perkins worked on it. So like, as what ifs go, it's actually pretty good. It's a little long though.
All of those stories felt like they were 10 pages too long.
Yeah. And it had that Roy Thomas problem of, I would rather 10 of those pages be spent on the Justice League fighting Surtur and losing, rather than the Justice Society talking about who they're related to and how the this and that and the what have you. So I'm on the fence. If I've got a lot of extra space, I would put it in. If you're reading these digitally, go ahead and read it, but maybe not. And then finally, Christmas with the Superheroes, #2. There's a short story with Dead Man and somebody who died in Crisis that is absolutely wonderful. Written by Alan Brennert, drawn by Dick Giordano. Whatever version of this I would put together, that would be the capper on the end. I don't want to say any more than that, but it's so good. It's so good.
It's a very sweet capper to the Crisis.
And then if we are trying to be as expansive as possible, Marvel did at least 2 Crisis-ish homages / pokes. The first being Quasar #17, which is a Mark Grunwald book where Quasar is watching the fastest beings in the Marvel Universe race from the Earth to the Moon in this specially created tunnel. So you've got Quicksilver, the Wizard, Mockery, Captain Marvel, a whole bunch of other people. And somewhere in the middle of this race, there's a burst of light, and there is another runner that is very fast. Maybe the fastest man alive?
Maybe the fastest man alive, yeah.
maybe the fastest man alive. It's about 10 pages out of the issue. I'm 99% sure the issue is available on the Marvel app. I don't want to say any more than that. It's also adorable. God bless Mark Grunwald to be able to save, not save, maybe the fastest man alive. And this one's going to be a little tougher to track down. It's not available digitally, but you can see it online in maybe certain places. Mighty Mouse, issue 4 and 5, has Mices on Infinite Earths. This came out in 91, I think, maybe 92. And it's written by Mike Gallagher, drawn by Ernie Colon, inked by Marie Severin. So
wow,
it's legit. We have Mighty Mouse, Mangy Mouse, Harbinger, the Piranha, Minotaur. I'm not saying it's as good as Crisis. As a parody / tweak, it's pretty spot on, I got to say. So that's how I would do this in 2024. Kind of final thoughts on...
Yeah, I mean, I love the way that you think about this stuff, and you always challenge the way that I think about collecting stuff, which is good. It's what we should do for one another, right? We should provide different perspectives. But the thing about Crisis is, when I keep coming back to this, I keep thinking about how while all the extra stuff we've talked about is fantastic, I don't know if there's any other event of this stature that needs as little else added to it. And I just think Crisis is really special. And I'm really happy we got to talk about this. So thank you for having me on to talk about this.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on and talking with me about Crisis and such a big comic. Again, where can people find you in all of your comic and non-comic incarnations?
First of all, just thank you again, Greg. This is always a highlight of my year. The couple times a year we get to talk comics together on a podcast. It's always fun. DC3cast.com. You can find all of my DC stuff for right now. Otherwise, I've eschewed social media as of late. I have a Facebook, but that is basically just for, actual friends in my life, the Greg Mataseviches of my life, if you will. But I am on Instagram at Brian Needs a Nap. That I don't post there a ton, but that's where you're most likely to see something from me. But overall, check out the podcast. My email is pretty easy to find on the internet if you want to send me an email. And as always, Greg, thank you so much for having me on.
Again, a big thank you to Brian for stopping by for a little crisis management. Next week, we have Michelle Fife and I from this year's Heroes Con, but before that, there is a bonus episode coming your way this very Monday, September 22nd. It's the first episode in our Robots Remastered series, where we are spotlighting vintage episodes of the show and delivering them in a more focused, compact presentation. Well, more focused and compact for this show, anyway. It may surprise you, or not, that Mike and I never really did any editing on these episodes outside of fixing technical errors and the like. I mean, when you're putting out 2 episodes a week for going on 8 years, something's gotta give. So we focus on giving you our tomfoolery as radio verite, even if that verite ran a little long. But now, we're able to start giving you these episodes in all-killer, no-filler configurations without losing any substantive material. It's still the robots you remember, just tighter. And if you've never heard these episodes before, I'll admit I'm biased, but I think you're in for a real treat. So what's coming this Monday that's so nice? Well, in honor of SPX 2025, we're representing episode 611, our SPX 2019 post-show discussion. This was Mike's first time ever going to the show, and it's not only great to get his fresh take on it, but it's fun to see how many of his points still hold true 6 years later. All that with an almost 45-minute shorter runtime. Wow. So keep an eye out for that on Monday and the Copra episode on Thursday. Please feel free to like, subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you are given the opportunity to do so. It really does help us get the word out about what we've got going on here on Earth Robot, and everyone here would greatly appreciate it. Until we meet again, my name is Greg. Stay safe, keep enjoying those funny books, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you for listening. Systems disengaged.